Void Miner. Epitaph of Helix. Part 6. Chapter 26. Hold the Line. The passage ahead stretched into silence, a corridor of shadow and faint luminescence that bent slowly downward, as though it spiraled toward some buried heart. Kara kept just a half step ahead, fragments thrumming at her side. Arg stayed behind her, heavy boots deliberate, shoulders hunched under the weight of both his gear and the choices they'd just made. The measures still rang in his bones. He'd felt them dig deeper than decisions. They'd pulled open places he'd spent years welding shut. Scarcity, betrayal, silence. All of them had worn at him once, and the cradle had measured what he had chose to keep. Now it wanted more. The corridor quivered. Arg halted instinctively, one hand against the wall. The shimmer wasn't light alone. It was intrusion. A signal echoing through the structure, pressure from outside. Kara looked back, eyes narrowing inside her visor. "They're trying to break through," he grunted. "Didn't think they'd wait long." Behind them, somewhere above the sealed antechamber, airlocks and breaches were being tested. He could almost hear the pounding of tools, the hiss of cutting torches, though he knew the cradle didn't transmit sound that way. It was something he carried from too many hull fights. The fragments pulsed once, harder. Not warning, summoning. "Go," he told Kara. "Deeper in." Her brow furrowed. "Alone?" "Trial's not going to wait. I'll hold the line." For a moment, she looked ready to argue, but the fragments answered for them, vibrating sharply at her hip and chest. They wanted her forward. She clenched her jaw, then gave a sharp nod. "Don't die, Arg." "Not planning on it." She vanished down the bend, light swallowing her. Arg turned back. The corridor behind him had reshaped itself, no longer the infinite curve of alien glass, but something more like a bastion. Angled walls, struts half-formed from living stone and light. The cradle was preparing the field. A sound rippled through the air, metallic and thin. He didn't need vision to know intruders were near. List mercenaries, most likely. EarthGov scavengers, maybe. Whoever had trailed them this far had the tools to burn through an airlock. The first figure breached. The wall at the far end split open in a scar of light, and a man in composite armor stumbled through. Behind him came two more, weapons raised. Arg didn't raise his own. He dropped his weight low, steady, fist curling. The chamber shifted again. Between him and them, 3 pillars rose from the ground, shimmering translucent. Each bore faint markings, not helix glyphs, but cradle geometry. The meaning pressed into him without words. Barriers. Choices. He realized the cradle wasn't just letting him fight. It was testing how. The mercs advanced. Arg darted left, using the nearest pillar for cover. A pulse of alien light surged through it, echoing into his suit, potential energy waiting for his touch. He laid a hand against it. The pillar hummed, then threw a sheet of force across the corridor, blocking the merc's aim. Bolts sparked against it harmlessly. Arg grinned despite himself. Not a weapon, a shield. The merc swore, one circling wide, trying to flank. Arg lunged before he thought, boots thundering. He slammed into the man, shoulder first, driving him into the wall. The armor cracked audibly. Arg stripped the rifle from his hand and sent it clattering down the corridor. The other two fired again. He ducked behind another pillar, forcing them to split fire. This one didn't throw a shield. It rippled instead, and a strange field expanded outward. His suit's sensors screamed warning. EM disruption. The merc's weapons faltered, lights flickering. Arg caught one by the arm and twisted, wrenching the gun free. He shoved the man hard, not killing, just disarming. The fragments pulsed approval against his chest. The last merc looked at him through a cracked visor, weapon half dead, stance wavering. Arg could have finished it clean. He didn't. Instead, he slammed his fist into the floor pillar again. The field surged brighter, catching the last man and lifting him off balance. Arg stepped in, hooked his boot, and dropped him hard. 3 intruders, 3 alive. Weapons scattered, comms fried. The cradle dimmed the pillars, lowered them back into the glass floor. Arg stood there breathing heavy, chest heaving against his harness. His knuckles ached. He hadn't drawn blood. Not theirs, not his. The fragments pulsed, smoother this time, not demanding, not harsh. They recognized restraint. More movement. He turned. Another breach scar split the far wall. More intruders came, 5 this time. He swallowed hard. Sweat dripped under the collar of his suit. The chamber didn't raise pillars this time. Instead, a wide net of light unfurled above them, strands like a web. Arg realized its intent as the mercs leveled rifles. Coordination. He had to keep them from firing as a unit. He moved quick, planting himself beneath one glowing strand. He slammed his palm into the floor again, urging the cradle. The strand descended, tethering him with a pulse. He jerked, half expecting restraint, but instead the strand followed his movements. He swung his arm out. The strand lashed like a whip, catching the nearest merc's weapon and yanking it wide. The blast scorched the wall harmlessly. Arg roared, half fury, half momentum, and swept the strand again. It tangled 2 mercs together, weapons colliding, both sprawling sideways. A third fired at him. Arg ducked behind the glowing net, and the cradle amplified his steep, sudden speed, shoving him across the floor into striking range. He drove his elbow into the merc's chest, cracking armor, but not crushing. The last 2 hesitated, rifles trembling. Arg could see it in their posture. They weren't loyal soldiers, just hired guns caught too deep. He met their visors with a steady glare. "Don't," he growled. Whether it was the cradle amplifying his voice, or the fragments thrumming like a storm, they froze. One dropped his rifle, the other backed toward the breach, muttering something Arg couldn't hear. The cradle strands recoiled, dissolving back into the ceiling. 5 more intruders alive. Arg sagged, sweat pouring, arms trembling from the strain of restraint. He'd learned in the belt long ago, it was easier to kill. Leaving men breathing took more out of you than the fight itself. The fragments pulsed again, steady and calm. Not approval this time. Recognition. He stood alone in the corridor. The breach scars sealed behind the mercs as they retreated. Light knitting shut like a wound healing. Silence returned, vast and suffocating. Arg leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for just a second. His heart hammered, echoing in his ears. But the cradle wasn't done. A voice, not sound, not words, but pressure, rolled through him. Not Kara's, not Helix's. Something alien, direct. Not destroyer, not executioner. Carrier who spares. His throat tightened. He hadn't thought of himself as anything but a miner, a wreck, a man scraping by. But the cradle had measured, and it saw something else. He pushed off the wall, boots heavy, body aching. Already the corridor brightened faintly, the direction Kara had gone. He started walking. By the time he reached the next threshold, his muscles burned and his mind felt frayed. The passage opened wide, light blooming outward. Kara stood there already, fragments blazing at her side, eyes sharp as she turned toward him. "You held them?" she asked. He nodded once. "Non-lethal. They'll walk again. A flicker of relief crossed her face. She didn't say it, but he saw it. Good. The threshold ahead yawned open. Together, they stepped into its glow. Chapter 27. Shards and Smoke. Smoke clung to the relay's veins like rot on old bone. Holt crouched against the wall of a fractured maintenance corridor, visor cracked, lungs working through filters that complained with every breath. His palms burned where the shard had tried to claw back into him, 1,000 phantom tendrils tearing at the nerves, begging not to be cut loose. It was gone now, stripped. He felt the absence in his skull like silence after artillery fire. Wrong, disorienting, too still. For weeks, maybe longer, the shard had nested in his head, purring data, whispering trajectories, bleeding predictive lines across every motion he made. It had felt like breathing 2 seconds ahead of the present, as if he'd been inside the rhythm of inevitability himself. He'd timed his charge detonations on its stride, each pulse telling him exactly when to place them. And now, stripped away, he was left human again, alone, finite, slow. The relay shuddered around him. Somewhere deep, charges were still venting atmosphere, systems folding in on themselves. He gutted its lattice heart, enough to make sure nothing could sing through it again. The list fleets would be reeling right now, stuttering across half the belt without their phantom conductor. Holt grinned despite the ache in his jaw. That'll teach you bastards to dance without music. The grin didn't last. The relay groaned like a dying beast, smoke curling upward through the shaft, and Holt remembered what came next. Getting out alive. He slung his pack over one shoulder, boots scraping against the angled plating as he moved. Every sound echoed too loud, too close. The relay was collapsing by degrees, not in a single bright blast, but a slow ruin, like a station starving of power. Bulkheads stuck half open. Fluids leaked from burst coolant lines. Sparks dripped lazy arcs onto the floor. And in all that time, there were still listmen. He caught the flicker of a visor ahead and ducked fast, back pressed against the wall. 2 of them, armor still lit, though their comms jittered. He could hear the panic in tiny bursts of half-words over their helmets, orders unsynced, telemetry lagging. Without the shard's pulse, they were blind men with rifles. Holt pulled a fragment of scrap from his belt, a melted shard of relay plating, sharp at one end. It clanged against metal and skittered into shadow. The mercs turned, weapons raised, firing blind bursts. Their aim staggered, shots slamming into the wrong wall, ricocheting into empty space. Holt moved when they weren't looking. Silent steps, close enough to smell their overheating suits. He rammed one into the bulkhead with a shoulder strike, ripped the rifle loose, and shoved him onto the floor. Both went down in a tangle. He didn't finish them. He didn't need to. Without sync, without coordination, they weren't soldiers anymore. They were just men choking in smoke. He left them there, clutching at each other. The climb out was slower than the entry. Every passage seemed to change shape, bulkheads warping as power died. The relay wasn't a station. It was a lattice skeleton, built for the shard's resonance, not human stability. Without its pulse, the thing was reverting to a carcass. Holt moved through it like a rat in a sinking ship. His mind kept trying to pull predictive paths across the debris, routes, warnings, movements, but there was nothing there, just silence. He swore under his breath and forced himself to rely on instinct. His instincts were old, carved from escape after escape. He could trust those. At the next shaft, he crouched by a viewport. Through fractured glass, he caught a glimpse of the belt, Fleets scattered across the horizon blinked like broken lanterns, formation gone. Ships wheeled erratically, signals stepping on each other. Even at this distance, Holt could feel it. Collapse. He touched the cracked visor of his helmet, chuckled once. There's your dance without the song. But satisfaction was short. The relay wasn't done shaking him off. The next corridor bled fire. Coolant tanks ruptured, flames burning blue-white in the zero-G pockets. Holt pressed low, skirting the edges, heat prickling his skin through the suit. His filters whined with every gulp of air. At the midpoint, a panel blew open, venting smoke and sparks. A shard of twisted plating missed him by inches. He stumbled, caught himself, and kept moving. Every step carried him deeper into memory. Smoke, fire, collapsing hull. He'd lived this before. A cradle, a mine, 1,000 stations left to rot. He always walked away, burned at the edges, but breathing. Always breathing. He reached the outer dock ring at last, or what was left of it. The tunnel opened into a broad chamber where half the docking clamps had sheared off. His ship, a battered shuttle painted over so many times it was more scar tissue than hull, waited at the far side, crooked but intact. 3 more list mercs stood between him and it. Their visors flickered, comms hissing nonsense. They hadn't seen him yet. Holt crouched, breathing steady. He had the rifle he'd stolen, 2 grenades, and his hands. But he was tired of killing. So he improvised. He twisted one grenade's cap halfway, primed it for smoke only, and rolled it across the floor. The hiss filled the chamber, thick plumes swallowing vision. The mercs fired anyway, blind panic, bolts cutting empty air. Holt moved in the haze like a ghost. Quick steps, sharp elbows. He struck them down one by one, not with bullets, but with bone and steel. When the smoke cleared, 3 men groaned on the floor, disarmed, alive. He didn't look back. The shuttle's hatch groaned as it sealed behind him. Holt collapsed into the pilot's chair, chest heaving. His fingers danced over cracked consoles, coaxing engines awake. Outside, the relay spasmed one last time, arcs of energy tearing through its frame. The engines flared. The shuttle tore free, spinning out into the void. Behind him, the relay finally gave up. It folded in on itself, lattice snapping, sections collapsing inward like ribs crushed in a fist. No grand explosion, just implosion, collapse, smoke scattering into vacuum. Holt watched it vanish in the rear screen, a graveyard, quiet and done. The shard was gone, the relay dead, but Holt wasn't free yet. He set the autopilot toward the belt shadow and leaned back, peeling his gloves off. His palms were red and raw, skin welted where the shard's tendrils had dug in. He flexed his fingers slowly. They shook. Telemetry collapse was confirmed. He'd seen it with his own eyes. The list fleets unraveling. Signals falling apart. Ark and Kara might actually get their chance inside the cradle now. But Holt knew better than to think he was safe. The list would hunt for whoever cut their strings. EarthGov would listen for whispers. Anyone who knew his name would be sharpening a knife. So Holt made the only move left. He dumped his identity. One by one, he burned everything. Comms logs, flight records, codes he'd hoarded across years. His ship's transponder screamed once it erased itself. The name on the console flickered out. He was no more. No past, no tether. Smoke and shards. He sat back in the dark, visor cracked, lungs rasping. A man untethered at last. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like freedom. It was bitter, and it was enough. Chapter 28. The Markers. The chamber stilled after the last surge of resonance. For a moment, Kara had thought the place had gone dark for good, that all their fumbling and near failures had burned the cradle out. But the silence wasn't absence. It was weight. Every panel of alloy and stone hummed with something too deep to be sound, and the air pressed thick against her visor as if it had gained mass. She stood motionless, arm lowered, fragment clutched in her hand. The shard's glow had dimmed, but not gone. Arg remained on the far side of the dais, his broad frame cast in the faint blue radiance from the walls. He held the seed tight against his chest, and in his other hand, fragment 4 glimmered like a sliver of frozen light. His visor hid his face, but his stillness told her enough. He was waiting to see what the cradle wanted next. Kara swallowed against the dryness in her throat. Her 2 fragments, numbers 2 and 3, still pulsed faintly. Their rhythms softened now that the locks had been answered. When she'd held them aloft together, their dissonance had nearly torn through her skull. Now they seemed calm, expectant. The chamber responded. Light crawled outward from the floor beneath the dais, not in glyphs she recognized, not in any written helix overlays. This was older. The symbols unspooled in carving organic forms, spirals that nested within one another, arcs that bent like ribs or veins. They flickered, adjusted, and then held steady, pale blue etchings suspended in the alloy. "Something's beginning," Kara whispered, though the words came out flat inside her helmet. Ark said nothing. He shifted one boot, and the sound echoed too loudly across the chamber, as though the place wanted every motion counted. Then the spirals aligned. The walls drew the light inward, focusing it toward the center dais, until the glow formed a tight column around the container they had just opened. The fragments in Kara's gloves grew warm. Ark's shard flared bright in answer. And then the voice came. Not words, not sounds, more like a pressure against thought itself, a resonance that reached through her skull. It didn't speak in language, but in structure. Kara felt the shape of it rather than hearing. Acknowledged. 2 keys. 2 carriers. Exam continues. Her breath quickened. She darted a glance at Arg. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, but his visor angled toward her as if to say he'd felt it too. The fragments vibrated. Kara clenched her teeth as both her shards pressed heat into her palm, crawling up her wrist, into the nerves of her arm. She hissed under her breath, but didn't let go. Arg shifted slightly, shoulders tight. Even through the helmet, Kara could see how the seed strained against him, its faint glow bleeding into the plates of his suit. Then the chamber pulsed. A ring of light spiraled outward, sweeping the floor. When it touched Kara's boots, she staggered back a step. Not from force. There was no push. Instead, it was inside her. The pulse raced into her chest, flared into her lungs, and pressed against her spine. She gasped and caught herself with one hand against the wall. The resonance whispered again. Markers required. Trial bond confirmed. Embedding. The pain came without warning. Her vision doubled, every line of the chamber splitting into 2, then 3, then collapsing back into 1. She clutched her fragments hard, knuckles white beneath the glove, the shards searing with heat and then cold, cycling faster than her nerves could manage. She tried to breathe, but her chest locked. On the dais, Arg went to one knee. His gauntlet slammed to the floor for balance, but he kept both relics clutched to him, refusing to release either. A low growl rolled through his comm, unintentional, more animal than word. Kara staggered forward, teeth clenched. Arg! Then it hit deeper. Her heartbeat raced, thundering in her ears. A rush of images flashed, memories that weren't hers. Cold corridors of a mining rig, the crack of rock fracturing beneath drills, a woman's voice, laughing, then gone. Arg's memories. She reeled as they flooded through her, raw and unshaped, spilling over the edges of her mind. Stop! She gasped, though she didn't know if she was speaking to him or the chamber. But the cradle didn't stop. The pulse came again, harder. Arg's back arched as though something had driven a spike into his spine. His growl broke into ragged breath. Kara stumbled toward him, but before she could reach, her vision split again. This time she wasn't seeing Arg's past. She was seeing through him. The chamber stretched from his angle, the spirals above, the glow of his shard in his hand. Her own figure stood before him, helmet catching the reflected blue. For a heartbeat, she saw herself through his eyes. The weight he carried, the mistrust pressed thin by necessity, the iron refusal to let anyone else take the burden from him. Then it snapped back. Kara staggered into her own vision again, pulse hammering, fragments hot in her grip. She realized what the cradle was doing. It was embedding them, not with commands, not with glyphs or instructions, with markers, genetic, mental, searing traits straight into marrow, testing if they could hold. The voice structure pressed into her thoughts again. Resilience. The pain in her chest spiked. Her lungs seized, refused to draw breath, then burned back to life. Kara dropped to one knee, helmet fogging with the heat of her breath. But she endured. Her pulse slowed, steadied. The fragments in her hand cooled slightly, as if satisfied. Across from her, Arg lifted his head. He was breathing hard, but steadying the same way. Adaptation. The chamber floor shifted, illusion or reality. Kara couldn't tell. But suddenly the dais was gone, and she was standing in a corridor half collapsed by rockfall. Air thinned. Emergency lights guttered. Somewhere in the dark, a voice cried for help. Scarcity. Mercy. She recognized the pattern from before. A test. But before she could act, her vision blurred again. She saw Arg in the same corridor, watching the same collapse, but from a different angle. She blinked, and she was back in her own body. The cradle wasn't separating them. It was forcing them to share. Arg moved first. He pressed his palm against a slab of stone, testing the weight, and then braced his back to shift it. Kara mirrored instinctively, dragging one of her fragments to mark a lever point. Together, whether by design or reflex, they moved. The rock gave. The corridor cleared. The voice faded, replaced with silence. When the vision blinked out, the chamber returned. The voice pressed again. Coordination. This time the fragments flared brighter than ever. Kara's breath caught. She could feel Arg, not beside her, but inside, his presence brushing against her mind like the edge of a thought that wasn't hers. Subtle, faint, but undeniable. A tether drawn tight. She stiffened, jaw clenched. Arg didn't speak. He didn't need to. The link said enough. The resonance swelled, brighter, higher, until it filled every corner of the chamber. Kara forced her eyes open, staring into the spirals of light as they drew together, weaving one final pattern. The fragments in her hand dimmed, cooling until they were little more than dull crystal. Arg's shard dulled the same way. Then the seed flared, one bright pulse, then silence. The voice whispered for the last time. Embedding complete. 2 chosen, 2 measured, 2 bound. Light drained from the walls. The spirals collapsed, fading into the alloy. The weight in the air lifted, leaving only the echo of breath inside Kara's helmet. She staggered to her feet, still clutching her shard. Arg stood slowly, shoulders heaving, visor tilted downward as if to hide what had just torn through him. The fragments were inert. The chamber was dark. But in the quiet, Kara could feel it, etched into her blood, her bones, her mind. A resilience not entirely her own, a sharpness of thought like edges honed, and a thread, faint but unbreakable, tethering her to the man across the dais. The cradle had given them its markers, and it had bound them together for whatever came next. Chapter 29. Verdict Returned. The chamber did not end with thunder. Arg had expected rupture, some final cascade of light, or maybe the ceiling collapsing in on them once the trial had run its course. Instead, it ended with quiet. The spirals had dimmed, the fragments had gone inert in his hand, and the only faint ticks of cooling alloy remained. He didn't move for a long time. His gloves were still tight around the seed and charred 4, though they no longer pulsed with heat. For the first time since stepping into this place, the relics felt lifeless, like rocks taken from a mine shaft. But the hollowness was a lie. He could feel the change lodge deeper than material, in bone, in blood. Kara hadn't said anything since the glow had vanished. She leaned against the far wall, visor dipped, shards 2 and 3 cradled loosely in her lap. Her breath rasped faint over the comm, unsteady, but slowing. Arg broke the silence first. Still alive? Kara let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, somehow. But the chamber wasn't done with him. A faint hiss came from the center dais. Arg lifted his head in time to see a seam appear in the alloy floor, running straight down the middle of the pedestal. Light traced the line, thin and sharp. It spread outward, sketching symbols that weren't helix glyphs, weren't even the organic spirals they'd seen before. These were blunt, angular, a script designed for clarity rather than beauty. Both their visors picked it up. The translation filter struggled, cycling through half-legible outputs before settling into approximation. The words cut stark across the feed. Verdict. Unstable, but viable. Kara inhaled sharply. That's it? That's the measure? Arg didn't answer right away. He read the words 3 times over, feeling the weight behind him. Unstable, but viable. He understood minds, ore veins that twisted, collapsed, killed men who trusted them too easily. But if the yield was rich enough, you dug anyway. You reinforced, braced, gambled. They weren't being told they passed. They were being told they could be used. He ground his teeth. Then another line appeared beneath the first, shorter, as if inserted from a different source. The script staggered imperfect, but the meaning struck clear. Rel, this was the first trial. Others are watching. Kara's head jerked up. Rel? Ark's chest went tight. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud since the hijacked ping in the last relay. He stared at the line, jaw set. Looks like he found a way in. Kara pushed herself upright, fragments held firm. First trial? What does that mean? Others are watching? Who the hell is others? Arg didn't answer immediately. His instincts screamed to strip the words down, grind them for any hidden meaning. Rel wasn't sloppy. If he'd carved this message into this cradle, it had been deliberate. Not all the Watchers were alien. Some were human. Some were probably already counting moves, placing bets. He finally said, "Means this wasn't the finish line, just the start." Kara cursed under her breath, soft and vicious. The chamber groaned then, as though tired of hosting them. The scenes in the dais sealed. The script bled away, and the residual glow faded into cold alloy. The cradle had given its verdict, nothing more. Arg pushed himself up to his full height. His joints ached in a way that had nothing to do with strain. Something about the embedding had worn him hollow. He'd secured the seed in its containment sling and clipped the shard beside it. Across the chamber, Kara stowed her 2 fragments. "We're done here," Arg said. Kara hesitated. For now. They didn't linger. The way out was harder than the way in. The corridors seemed narrower, darker. Arg led, boots thudding against the ancient plating, weapons kept low but ready. He expected ambush at every turn, scavengers who hadn't trailed them, or worse, systems the cradle had woken that would now judge them not as candidates, but intruders. But the halls stayed empty. The silence pressed heavier than any firefight. By the time they reached the first lock, Arg noticed the shift in comm static. Not noise. Interference. Someone outside was trying to force a line through. He froze, lifted one glove hand for Kara to halt. She crouched automatically, shard secure in her pocket. "Talk," Arg muttered. The static broke for half a second, and a single word bled through. Not cradle voice, not alien resonance. A single human word, sharp and cutting. "Return." Arg's gut clenched. He recognized the tone, the way it had been cut into bandwidth. That shouldn't have even been available. It was the same cadence as the earlier rel dropped. Only this time, it was smaller, compressed. They reached the outer lock before it repeated. The Dust Widow still clamped to the docking ring floating steadily outside the viewport, battered hull lit faint in the starlight. Kara's breath caught as another pulse bled through their comms. "Return. Verdict returned." The phrase dissolved into static again. Kara whispered, "It's him. It has to be." Arg keyed his suit to block the frequency, unwilling to let it drag into their systems any deeper. But the damage was already done. He'd heard what he'd needed. Verdict confirmed. Rel watching. He cycled the lock, ushered Kara through. The widow felt smaller than he remembered. Arg climbed the ladder into the cockpit, dropped into the pilot's chair, and began powering systems in low draw. No light, no active comm. Just enough to warm the drives. If scavengers were still nearby, they couldn't risk lighting themselves up like a beacon. Kara strapped into the secondary chair, eyes on the viewport. The fragments lay in her lap, inert but heavy. Arg glanced once, then turned back to the console. "Scav groups will regroup," he said. "They always do." Kara nodded. "So we undock? Quiet." Arg's hands worked automatically, coaxing the widow free of her moorings, with a miner's patience. No burn, no sudden thrusts, just a slow drift, the clamps releasing one by one until the ship slid back into the open black. The cradle shrank behind them, a silhouette carved against the stars, cold and silent once more. Arg didn't look back long. "Unstable but viable," Kara murmured. The words sounded raw in her throat. "What the hell does that mean for us?" Arg stared at the instruments, his jaw clenched, but he kept his voice even. "Means we're not broken enough to be thrown away, but not solid enough to be trusted either. Kara turned toward him. And Rel? What did he mean? Others are watching? Ark tightened his grip on the stick, eyes hard on the dark ahead. Means we've stepped into something bigger than just relics. We were measured, judged, and someone out there wanted us to know it. The widow cleared the debris field. Ark angled her nose toward the belt's deeper lanes, keeping the burn low, barely above drift. No lights, no beacon, only silence. The chamber's verdict still rang in his chest like a bruise that wouldn't heal. Unstable, but viable. He didn't know if that was a blessing or a death sentence. But for now, they were still alive, and they were leaving. Chapter 30. Fade to Black. Holt had learned long ago that endings didn't come with noise. The big ones, wars, empires, alliances, they didn't crash like a wave or burst like a shell. They went out like a dying signal. A slow dimming, a stutter in the feed, a quiet fade. You only knew it was over when the silence stretched too long. He stood in the shadow of a dead relay, the skeletal frame still bleeding sparks from where he'd torn its heart loose. His charges had gone off clean, cracking the lattice open in a synchronized pulse. The AI's sync thread, the one that had been coordinating the list's scattered fleets, was gone. He had felt it, like a taut wire cut mid-vibration. The chatter had collapsed in on itself. And yet, not all of it. His console on the Ashen Mile still picked up ghost pings, scattered and inconsistent. Some list signals stuttered, others fell mute entirely, but a fraction still pulsed, faint and staggered. The AI wasn't dead, only wounded. Holt leaned forward in the pilot's chair, fingers moving across battered controls. His face stayed lit in the green glow of old screens as he tuned through the static. A pattern emerged, not central, not whole, but distributed. The thing he'd killed here was only a shard. The list had more than one heart. He breathed out slow, controlled, the old calm settling in. He'd cut a tendon, not the spine. That meant they could still fight, still regroup, but not with the same sharpness. Their stride was broken. Shifts without rhythm, captains without coordinated whispers, enough to tilt battles if someone was ready to strike. He wasn't here for battles. He was here to vanish. The Ashen Mile drifted free of the relay's carcass. Holt worked the controls like a surgeon, bleeding just enough thrust to slide her between debris. No flare, no trail that would light him against the starfield. His hand brushed the radio toggle out of reflex. He didn't switch it on. Not yet. He didn't trust the silence. Instead, he went back to the work he hated most, confirming. The explosion had sent a predictive echo through the net. He called up the sequence. Verdict simulations, hacked from the same back doors Rel had once traced. The program didn't lie. List's communications were fractured at 57%. Coordination degraded across 2 sectors, partial in 3 more. Holt studied the feed with the precision of a man who knew what even one mistake would cost. He rewound, checked again. Same results. The fleet had lost its perfect rhythm. The shard here had been vital, but not singular. He sat back in the chair, shoulders heavy, but posture still taut. "So you're bigger than I thought," he muttered. The ship didn't answer. He didn't linger. Every second spent near the relay was a second someone could trace him. The blast would have registered across half the belt. Scavengers, militias, maybe EarthGov's hounds. Someone would come sniffing. Holt toggled a sequence he hadn't used in years. A burn pattern disguised as decay. His engines coughed. spat out uneven thrust, then steadied into a stuttering crawl that mimicked the ship dying. On scans, he'd look like salvage waiting to be picked cleaned, but nobody paid attention to corpses unless they smelled profit. Profit seekers didn't survive long around him. He set the mile on her path and went to work on the radios. Holt had once been the comnet, the bloodstream of the belt. Every contract, every betrayal, every alliance, it all ran through these signals. Cut the lines, and you didn't just blind men, you starved them. He didn't have the tools to destroy the list outright, but he could poison the blood. The shard he'd killed here had kept their sync pulse steady, smoothing signals across fleets light minutes apart. Without it, chatter turned sloppy, delayed, jagged. Ships that should have moved like fingers of one hand would now stumble over each other, enough to shift the war. It wasn't enough for Holt. He opened the miles-old software, a patchwork of stolen code, belt-borne tricks, and fragments of Rel's early scripts. One by one, he pushed out bursts of junk, encrypted trash, mimic beacons, phantom orders, all fed into the list's weakened channels. It wouldn't hold forever. They'd adapt, filter, harden their pathways. But for a window of hours, maybe days, they'd be chasing their own tails. That was all Holt needed. The belt wasn't kind to hesitation. When the work was done, Holt sat back, staring at the empty viewport. The stars didn't care. The debris drifted. The relay's corpse spun lazy in silence. He keyed one last sequence. Erasure. The Miles navlog, comm buffers, everything that could tie him to the strike burned away in a sweep of white code. To anyone who checked, the ship had never been there. And then, finally, he flipped the radio. Not to transmit. To stone. Miles' comm array hissed, then froze. Every channel locked in hard suppression. From this point forward, the ship would receive nothing but static. No pings, no summons, no betrayals. It was the closest thing to peace Holt had ever allowed himself. He leaned back in the chair and let the silence stretch, his breath fogging the inside of his visor before the filters cleared it. His hands stayed steady on the armrest, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't poised for the next strike. The list was crippled, not destroyed, but broken enough to stagger. Arg and Kara, wherever they were, would have one less monster breathing down their necks. Holt didn't plan to see them again. He had burned his trail, turned the radios to stone, and folded himself into the dark. The belt would forget his shape. The fleets would stumble. The watchers, whoever they were, would move their pieces without knowing his. That was enough. No victory song, no grand ending, just the fade, like everything else. Holt closed his eyes, and the ashen mile drifted deeper into black. Epilogue. The Dust Widow drifted without thrust, its battered hull floating in a pocket of silence between fractured asteroids. Systems hummed at low power. Half-dark corridors, filtered air recycling with a tired wheeze. Reactor throttled down until only a faint heat lingered through the bulkheads. The stars outside looked sharper in this quiet, points of white fire scattered across the black that felt infinite. Out here, there was no horizon, just the deep and the endless. Inside, Arg sat in the pilot's chair, shoulders heavy, hands resting useless on his knees. The console before him displayed nothing urgent, stable drift, hull integrity holding, comms muted to a dead channel. The cradle was behind them now, locked away in silence like every other ruin of the Helix War. But the weight of it hadn't left. It never did. It clung, thicker than gravity. He rubbed at his temple with the back of his hand, then leaned back until the chair creaked. For years, he'd thought solitude was his only shield. No one to answer to, no one to lose again. But solitude had teeth, and lately it had been chewing through him. Footsteps approached in the narrow passage behind, a lighter tread than his own, careful but certain. Kara. She came into the cockpit, her face pale in the starlight pouring through the viewport. She didn't speak right away, just stood, watching the stars with him. For several long minutes, the only sound was the faint hum of life support fans. Then she exhaled. Feels like we should be moving. Like if we sit still, something's going to find us. Ark tilted his head, but didn't look over. Maybe. Or maybe everything's just too quiet. Makes it feel wrong. She crossed her arms, leaning against the bulkhead. Her fragment, inert now, hung in a pouch at her belt. Its glow had faded to nothing after the chamber closed, like it had spent everything it had left. Arg's seed and his fragment were the same, quiet stones, as if asleep. Kara's eyes flickered toward him, her voice softer. Do you feel it? He didn't need to ask what she meant. The low hum in the back of his skull. Not sound, but presence. The cradle's mark. He gave a slow nod. Yeah, hard to miss. She didn't answer. Her gaze drifted back to the stars. The widow had been built for one man, one life, one rhythm of work and silence. Having another body aboard shifted everything. The air seemed thinner, recycled faster. Compartments that once felt merely small now felt crowded. The galley only had one chair welded to the deck, one cup hook above the console. Ark had never needed more. Now there were two of them, and the ship felt like it was holding its breath. They ate rations side by side, no table between them. Kara perched on a crate while Arg sat on the welded chair. Conversation was scarce at first, the kind of silence born not from anger, but from exhaustion. Like words themselves weighed too much. She chewed slowly, eyes fixed on nothing. After a long pause, she murmured, I thought it would kill us. That chamber, every second in there. I was sure we'd snap before it opened. Ark swallowed his mouthful, wiped his fingers on a rag. That was the point. Her lip twitched. Not a smile, not really. Always so damn certain. I'm not certain, Ark said. I just keep moving. That shut them both up for a while. Later, when the ship's lights dimmed for rest cycle, Kara stretched out in the narrow crew bunk Ark had cleared for her. He had pulled old tools and rags from the compartment, shoving them into storage crates. It wasn't much of a bed, just a pad, thin as paper, straps to hold the sleeper steady in zero spin. But it was hers now. He lay in the cockpit instead, seat tilted back, boots propped against the console. He kept his eyes half shut, pretending he could ignore the steady thrum in his skull, the cradle's gift, or curse. In the silence of the ship, drifting between the stars, he realized he wasn't alone. Not really. Not anymore. On the second day adrift, Kara came to him with eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. She stood in the cockpit hatchway, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something in. You see it too, don't you? She asked. Ark studied her. See what? The puzzles, she said, her voice thin. From the chamber. They keep replaying. Not the same way, not exactly, but close. Like it wants me to solve them again. Mercy with no food, trust with no comms. Same choices, circling. Arg leaned back, eyes closed. Yeah, keeps me awake too. Like the exam didn't end when the chamber opened, just moved inside our heads. She gave a bitter laugh, quiet. And here I thought nightmares were bad enough. Silence stretched. Arg finally opened his eyes, fixing her with that steady gaze. It's not just memory. It's measure. Markers, remember? Resilience, speed, awareness. They're watching how we hold it together. Kara's throat worked. Who's watching? Arg had no answer. He just looked back at the stars. She didn't press. She came inside and sat on the deck at his feet, knees pulled close, as if grounding herself against the hum of the ship. For a long time, they stayed like that. Two figures adrift in a ship too small, shadows lit only by cold starlight. It was on the fourth day that the silence broke differently. They had eaten, cleaned up, and drifted back to the cockpit to watch the stars as they always did. Kara's hair hung loose, messy from a half-sleep. Arg's stubble was thick across his jaw, his eyes hollow but awake. She spoke without looking at him. I don't want to go back to being alone. Arg turned slightly. She kept her gaze outward, locked on the scatter of stars. She went on, voice quieter now. Before Helix took me, before all this, I thought my life was already alone. My family was gone, my crew gone, scattered or dead. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that I could handle it, that I didn't need anyone. Her throat tightened, words faltering. But in that chamber, it used that against me. It showed me exactly how easy it is to fall apart when there's no one left to stand beside you. Arg sat with it, heavy silence pressing close. Finally he said, Same here. Kara blinked at him, surprised. He rubbed his palm against his knees, jaw tense. Lost my wife years ago. Thought I could mine rock till I ran out of air, and that'd be enough. Didn't want anyone else around. Too much risk of losing them. His voice rasped, low. But that chamber, it knew. Pressed on it. Made it sure I remembered every damn moment. Kara swallowed hard. That's cruel. That's the test, Arg said. She shook her head, eyes glassy but fierce. Then maybe passing it isn't about being strong. Maybe it's about admitting we can't do it alone. Arg didn't answer, but he didn't look away from her either. By the sixth day, they had begun to speak more. Little things at first. Ship systems, ration counts, trajectory corrections, then deeper. They both knew the trial wasn't over. The chamber had only been one. Rel's final message still burned in Arg's memory. This was the first trial. Others are watching. It hung over them like a shadow. Kara sat curled in the cockpit's chair, legs tucked beneath her, staring at the dim console readouts. I don't know if I can face another one. Arg leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. We don't have a choice. That's not what I asked, she said sharply. Then her voice softened. I'm tired, Arg. So damn tired. Every time we make it through, something else rises up. Another test, another fight. I don't know how much more I've got. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You've got enough for one more. Always one more." Her lips parted, ready to snap back, but she stopped, because somehow she believed him. That night, with the ship dimmed, Arg dozed in the pilot seat again. The hum in his head wouldn't let him rest. He thought Kara was asleep, but then her voice came, quiet, from the corridor. "I don't want to be alone anymore." Arg sat up, blinking in the dark. She stood in the hatchway, arms loose at her sides, hair falling over her face. She repeated it, steadier now. "I don't want to be alone anymore. Not after all of this." He rose slowly from the chair, heavy boots against the deck. They stood facing each other in the faint glow of the console. "I don't either," Arg said at last. His voice was raw, as if dragged up from a place long sealed. They didn't move closer, not yet. Just stood there, words hanging between them like fragile glass. But the hum in their heads shifted, a resonance smoothing, the chamber's mark responding. Over the next days, the rhythm of the widow changed. 2 cups hooked on the galley wall, 2 bodies moving through the narrow corridors, brushing shoulders. Shared silence that no longer felt suffocating, but full. They spoke more easily now. Kara teased him about his rough edges, his refusal to shave, his hoarding of old parts. He told her stories of mining runs, of near deaths in lucky hauls. She laughed, a sound the widow had never carried before. At night, they sat in the cockpit, watching stars. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. Both ways felt like enough. The hum in their skulls never left, but it no longer felt like intrusion, more like connection, a thread between them, subtle but real. One evening, Kara rested her head back against the chair, eyes half shut. "This feels like home," she said quietly. Arg looked at her, then back at the stars. "Yeah," he said. "It does." The dust widow drifted on, a speck between endless suns. 2 figures inside, scarred and weary, carrying marks that tied them to something far larger than themselves. Trials yet to come, shadows yet to rise. But for the first time, they would not face them alone. Kara's hand brushed against his on the console. He didn't pull away. They sat in silence, watching the stars burn. And for the first time in years, Arg didn't feel alone out here. The end of Void Miner, Epitaph of Helix.